March 1969, Lenox Avenue, 2:47 a.m. Frank Lucas watched three men walk out of Small's Paradise with empty hands. They'd gone in carrying cash. They came out with nothing. No product, no promise. Just a story about lab fires in Marseille and heat at the Canadian border. The fourth time that week, someone said the pipeline was dry. He stood across the street in the shadow of a storefront awning, 41 years old, dressed like he didn't need to impress anyone. The men didn't see him. They got into a Buick Electra and sat there for 10 minutes, not moving, not talking. Then the driver started the engine and they disappeared south toward 125th. Lucas knew what that silence meant. 3 mid-level distributors with regular customers and no supply. In 2 weeks, maybe 3, their buyers would be desperate. In a month, they'd be someone else's buyers. The old system was dying, and everyone on the street could feel it, but no one knew what came next. What no one realized at the time was that the question had already been answered. For 20 years, heroin in Harlem came through one door. The French refined it in laboratories outside Marseille. Canadian syndicates moved it across the border. Italian families in New York distributed it through networks that controlled everything from the docks to the street corners. It was predictable, it was reliable, and it was untouchable, because everyone who mattered was either paid or eliminated. Then the federal government decided it mattered. In 1968, the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs expanded operations in ways that hadn't been possible before. International task forces, wiretaps that crossed borders, arrests that started in Turkey and ended in Brooklyn. The French connection wasn't dismantled in one raid. It was choked slowly, shipment by shipment, until the laboratories shut down and the routes dried up. By early 1969, Harlem's dealers were cutting product so thin it barely worked. Prices doubled. Quality collapsed. People who'd never missed a delivery in a decade were suddenly scrambling. The vacuum wasn't coming. It was already here. Frank Lucas had been watching it happen for months, and he hadn't said a word to anyone. He'd come up under Bumpy Johnson, the man who ran Harlem the way a mayor runs a city. Not with violence, though violence was always available, but with structure. Bumpy understood that power wasn't about fear. It was about reliability. You kept the streets predictable, you kept the money flowing, and you kept your word. Lucas spent 15 years watching how that worked. He drove Bumpy's car. He sat in rooms where decisions were made. He learned that the real power wasn't on the corner. It was in the supply. When Bumpy died in July 1968, there was no succession plan. There was no structure left to inherit. And within 6 months, the pipeline Bumpy had relied on was gone too. Most people saw chaos. Lucas saw an opening. April 1969. A warehouse basement off Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard. No windows. One exit. Lucas sat across a table from a man named Dominic Catano, a mid-level Italian operator who used to move weight through the French connection. Catano had called the meeting. He was trying to rebuild something, pulling together scraps of the old network, looking for partners. "We can make this work," Catano said. "I got people in Montreal. They got people in Europe. It's not dead. It's just reorganizing." Lucas didn't respond right away. He let the silence sit there. "You in or not?" Catano asked. "How long before product moves?" Lucas said. 2 months. Maybe 3. "And the price?" Catano hesitated. "Higher than before. But it'll come down once things stabilize." Lucas stood up. "Good luck with that." "Where are you going?" Catano said, half standing. "You think you got a better option?" Lucas looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not waiting for Europe to fix itself." He walked out. Catano didn't follow. 2 weeks later, Catano was arrested in a federal sweep. He'd been under surveillance for 5 months. Every meeting, every phone call, every warehouse, documented. The old network wasn't just broken. It was radioactive. Anyone still trying to rebuild it was walking into a spotlight. Lucas had already decided he wasn't rebuilding anything. What Frank Lucas understood, what most people in the drug trade didn't, was that the collapse of the French connection wasn't just an enforcement victory. It was a market failure. The system had worked because it was efficient, but it was also rigid. It depended on laboratories in France, routes through Canada, and distribution networks controlled by a handful of families. When federal investigators targeted those choke points, the entire structure collapsed. But demand didn't collapse. Addicts in Harlem didn't stop needing heroin because the French stopped refining it. The market was still there. The question was who would supply it. Lucas decided the answer was him. May 1969. Lucas boarded a flight to Bangkok. He told almost no one where he was going. His wife knew he was traveling. A cousin who handled street-level operations knew to keep things running. That was it. No announcements. No partners. No paper trail. Southeast Asia in 1969 was the center of global opium production. The Golden Triangle, Burma, Laos, Thailand, produced more raw opium than anywhere else in the world. It had been that way for generations, but the Vietnam War had turned the region into something else. American military logistics moved through the area constantly. Planes, cargo ships, contractors, supply routes. It was a machine built to move massive quantities of material from Asia to the United States. And it operated with a level of access and efficiency that no criminal network could match. Lucas didn't invent the idea of using military logistics to smuggle drugs. But he was one of the first American traffickers to recognize that the opportunity was there, and that no one was watching closely enough to stop it. He spent 3 weeks in Thailand and Laos, meeting suppliers, negotiating terms, and mapping out a supply chain that bypassed every traditional middleman. No European refiners, no Canadian syndicates, no Italian distributors, just raw opium from the source, refined locally, and shipped directly to New York. When he returned to Harlem in June, he didn't tell anyone what he'd arranged. He just waited. August 1969. A small apartment on 116th Street, 11:30 p.m. A dealer named Clarence "Red" Tatum sat at his kitchen table counting cash. Red had been moving heroin in Harlem for 12 years. He knew the rhythms. He knew the players. He knew when product was late, when quality was slipping, when prices were about to jump. For the past 6 months, he'd been struggling. His supplier couldn't get clean product. When product did arrive, it was cut so thin that customers complained. Red was losing buyers to dealers who had slightly better connections, slightly better quality. He was watching his business die slowly. Then someone knocked on his door. Red opened it to find a kid he didn't recognize. Early 20s. Quiet. Carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Frank Lucas sent me," the kid said. Red looked at the package. "I don't know Frank Lucas." "You will." The kid left the package on the hallway floor and walked away. Red stood there for a full minute before picking it up. Inside was a sample, maybe 2 grams, and a phone number written on the wrapping. Red tested it that night. It was the purest heroin he'd seen in 2 years. Maybe the purest he'd ever seen. He called the number the next morning. The thing about Frank Lucas's operation, what made it different from everything that came before, was the economics. When heroin moved through the French Connection, it passed through multiple hands. Turkish farmers sold raw opium to smugglers. Smugglers sold it to French refiners. Refiners sold it to transporters. Transporters sold it to Italian distributors. Italian distributors sold it to mid-level operators. Each transfer added cost, risk, and dilution. Lucas eliminated most of that. He bought directly from producers in Southeast Asia. He controlled the refinement. He controlled the shipping. And he kept distribution tight, relying on family members and a small circle of trusted associates. The result was heroin that was significantly cheaper and dramatically more pure than anything else on the market. By late 1969, Red Tatum wasn't the only dealer switching suppliers. Across Harlem, street-level operators were quietly disconnecting from old networks and connecting to Lucas's. It wasn't loyalty. It was survival. Customers went where the product was better, and dealers followed the customers. Within 6 months, Lucas controlled more of Harlem's heroin trade than anyone had since Bumpy Johnson. And law enforcement had no idea who he was. January 1970. A federal office in Lower Manhattan. 9:15 a.m. Special Agent Richie Roberts sat in a briefing room reviewing surveillance reports. The Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs had spent the past 2 years dismantling the French Connection, and the results were measurable. Arrests were up, seizures were up, major trafficking figures were in prison or fleeing the country. But something wasn't adding up. Street-level heroin arrests in Harlem hadn't dropped. If anything, they'd increased slightly. More confusing, the quality of seized heroin was higher than it had been in years. Roberts had seen the lab reports. Some samples tested at 70, 80, even 90% purity. Before the French Connection collapsed, anything above 50% was rare. "Where's it coming from?" Roberts asked the room. No one had an answer. The problem was visibility. The old networks were known. Investigators understood the structure, the players, the patterns. When you arrested someone connected to the French Connection, you knew who they worked for and where the product originated. But this new heroin? It appeared on the streets with no clear origin, no obvious distribution hierarchy, no connection to known trafficking organizations. Someone had built a pipeline while everyone was watching the old one burn. Roberts pulled out a map of Harlem and started marking locations where high-purity heroin had been seized. The dots didn't form a pattern he recognized. No centralized distribution point, no obvious territories. Just a steady flow of product moving through street-level dealers who, when arrested, claimed they didn't know where it came from. That was the first lie. Everyone knew where their product came from. The second lie was quieter. When investigators started asking questions about new suppliers, dealers mentioned a name, Frank Lucas, but no one seemed to know much about him. Mid-level operator. Used to work for Bumpy Johnson. Kept a low profile. Roberts wrote the name on the board. It didn't mean anything yet. It would. March 1970. The Turntable, a nightclub on 135th Street, just after midnight. Frank Lucas sat in a corner booth with his wife Juliana and 2 associates. The club was loud, crowded, full of people celebrating the weekend. Lucas wasn't celebrating. He was working. Every conversation, every handshake, every person who stopped by the table, he was reading the room, measuring power, tracking who owed what to whom. A man named Nicky Barnes walked in, young, flashy, loud. Barnes ran his own heroin operation in Harlem, independent of Lucas, but not yet competitive. He spotted Lucas across the room and made his way over. "Frank," Barnes said, extending his hand. Lucas shook it but didn't stand. "Nicky." "I keep hearing your name," Barnes said, smiling. "People say you got the best product in the city." "People talk," Lucas said. "They do, and when they talk that much, other people start paying attention." It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. Barnes was telling him to be careful, to stay quiet, to not get too visible. It was good advice. Lucas didn't take it. "Let them pay attention," Lucas said. "I'm not hiding." Barnes studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right then. Just remember, the higher you climb, the further you fall." He walked away. Lucas watched him go. Juliana leaned in close. "He's not wrong," she said quietly. Lucas finished his drink. "He's not right either." The truth was, Frank Lucas didn't think he was climbing. He thought he'd already arrived. By mid-1970, his operation was generating millions of dollars annually. He owned properties across Harlem. He had connections in law enforcement, city government, and the music industry. He wasn't hiding in basements anymore. He was living openly, visibly, in a way that the old traffickers never had. That visibility was both power and risk. Power, because it signaled dominance. Risk, because it made him a target. What Lucas didn't fully understand yet, what no one in his position ever fully understands, is that the same visibility that builds an empire also marks it for destruction. Summer 1970. Federal investigators began noticing patterns. A series of arrests in Harlem, Newark, and the Bronx turned up heroin that lab tests confirmed came from the same source. Not the same distributor, the same chemical signature, suggesting it was refined in the same facility. That was unusual. Heroin from different trafficking organizations typically came from different sources, with different processing methods. This suggested vertical integration. Someone controlled production, refinement, and distribution. Surveillance efforts intensified. Agents started tracking financial flows, monitoring known associates, documenting luxury purchases. Lucas's name appeared more frequently in reports, but always in connection with low-level operators. No one had placed him at the top of a trafficking organization yet. Then a mid-level dealer named Jerome "Fat Cat" Mitchell was arrested in Newark with 17 kilograms of heroin in his trunk. Mitchell had priors. He was facing serious time. When federal agents offered him a deal, he gave them a name: Frank Lucas. It still wasn't enough for an indictment. Mitchell was a dealer, not a distributor. His testimony placed Lucas in the supply chain, but didn't prove Lucas ran it. Federal prosecutors needed more: financial records, wiretaps, surveillance footage, corroboration from multiple sources. Building that case would take time, more time than anyone realized. Fall 1970. Lucas expanded operations into New Jersey, Philadelphia, and parts of the Midwest. His product moved through networks built on personal relationships rather than organizational hierarchies. Brothers, cousins, childhood friends from North Carolina, people Lucas trusted completely, people who had no criminal records, people who didn't fit the profile of major drug traffickers. This structure made the organization difficult to penetrate. When investigators flipped a street-level dealer, that dealer only knew one link in the chain, usually a family member of Lucas's who wouldn't cooperate. When they arrested a family member, that person had no incentive to testify. Loyalty wasn't enforced through violence, it was built through blood. For nearly 2 years, this model worked perfectly. January 1971. A federal task force was formed specifically to investigate Frank Lucas. By this point, investigators had pieced together enough information to understand the scale of his operation. Financial analysis suggested he was generating between $50 million and $100 million annually. Surveillance indicated he had direct connections to suppliers in Southeast Asia. Informants confirmed he controlled the majority of heroin distribution in Harlem and significant portions of markets in surrounding cities. But they still didn't have the evidence needed to arrest him. The problem was access. Lucas rarely handled product directly. He didn't use phones for incriminating conversations. He paid people in cash. His financial assets were hidden behind shell companies and real estate holdings. And his inner circle, the people who actually knew how the operation worked, were family members who would never testify. Special Agent Richie Roberts, now leading the task force, understood that bringing down Lucas would require patience. They needed to build the case carefully, documenting every transaction, every connection, every flow of money and product. One mistake, one rushed arrest, one piece of inadmissible evidence, and Lucas would walk. So they waited, and watched, and documented everything. Spring 1971, 147th Street and Bradhurst Avenue, 4:30 a.m. A shipment arrived. 3 duffel bags delivered by a man no one recognized, picked up by Lucas's cousin. The exchange took less than 2 minutes. No words, no witnesses, just a transfer in the dark. What Frank Lucas didn't know was that federal agents had been watching that corner for 6 weeks. They'd identified the delivery schedule. They'd photographed the courier. They'd tracked the duffel bags to a storage facility in Queens. The case was building. Slowly, methodically, piece by piece. By summer 1971, investigators had enough evidence to request wiretaps. By fall, they had financial records showing unexplained wealth. By winter, they had testimony from 2 mid-level distributors willing to cooperate. Frank Lucas had built his empire in the vacuum left by the French Connection. He'd proven that traditional trafficking networks weren't necessary, that vertical integration and direct supply chains could generate more profit with less risk. He'd operated for nearly 3 years as the most successful heroin trafficker in New York City while remaining almost invisible to law enforcement. But invisibility doesn't last forever. The same federal attention that destroyed the French Connection was now focused entirely on him. Every move was being watched. Every transaction was being recorded. Every associate was being pressured to cooperate. The empire Lucas built by recognizing an opportunity in 1969 was now, in late 1971, standing on a foundation that was quietly, methodically, being dismantled from below. He didn't know it yet, but the investigation was already over. They just hadn't made the arrests. December 1971. Lucas sat in the same booth at the turntable where he'd dismissed Nicky Barnes's warning a year earlier. The club was packed, music loud, people dancing. Everything looked the same as it always had. But something was different. Small things. Conversations that stopped when he walked past. Associates who didn't return calls. A federal agent who made eye contact across the street and didn't look away. Lucas finished his drink and stood up. Juliana looked at him. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. He scanned the room one more time, reading faces, measuring distances, calculating options he didn't want to calculate. "Nothing," he said finally. "Let's go home." They walked out into the cold December night. The street was quieter than usual. Fewer cars, fewer people. Just the sound of their footsteps on frozen pavement. What Frank Lucas didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that federal agents were already drafting arrest warrants. That surveillance teams were documenting his movements 24 hours a day. That prosecutors were preparing indictments that would eventually involve dozens of arrests across multiple states. The vacuum he'd filled in 1969 had made him powerful. The empire he'd built had made him wealthy. But the visibility he'd embraced had made him a target. And in late 1971, with federal investigators closing in and his operation under surveillance from every angle, the same system that had eliminated the French connection was preparing to eliminate him. The question wasn't whether he'd fall. The question was how much of Harlem would fall with him. But that story, the arrest, the trial, the cooperation that followed, belongs to a different chapter. This chapter ends here, in December 1971, with Frank Lucas walking home through Harlem, still believing he controlled his empire, still believing his invisibility would last, still believing the vacuum would protect him. The vacuum didn't protect him. It just gave him room to rise high enough that the fall would be visible from everywhere. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, like, and share it. More stories history didn't tell are coming next.